In this chilling story, we follow the unsettling journey of a man battling both cancer and the ghosts of his past. As he begins chemotherapy, he starts seeing a mysterious little girl in a black dress, someone his dying mother claimed to have seen before her death. What begins as a terrifying encounter slowly unravels into a dark family secret that has been haunting him for years. Get ready for a story that blurs the lines between life, death, and the lingering presence of those we may never have known. I was at the hospital with my mother. She was very sick and confused. She's elderly and has a kidney infection, which the doctor said was affecting her behavior. The doctor also mentioned that her kidneys were no longer strong, and if they failed, they would have to insert a line into her chest for dialysis. However, my stepfather did not want that for my mother, which I understood. What's the point? What quality of life would she have at her age with more procedures? My wife and I would stay by her bedside to calm her down sometimes. When we weren't there, the nurse would tie her hands to the bed so she wouldn't pull out her IV line and other tubes because she was confused and combative. One night, my wife was home with our kids. She made some noodle soup for me to take to the hospital for my mother. When I arrived, my stepfather was sleeping on a chair in my mother's hospital room. I woke him up and I told him that since I was there, he should go home and get some rest. But he said he'd just go eat and shower, and then return to spend the night with my mother. After that, he left. I set my mother up to feed her the foods that my wife made. Her infection was improving, and she wasn't as confused anymore, so the nurse no longer needed to tie her hands. After feeding her, she told me not to leave until my stepfather got back. I asked her why. Didn't the nurses take good care of her? My mother said she was scared. She kept seeing my deceased father coming in and out of her room, but what frightened her more was a little girl in a black dress. I reassured her it was nothing, probably just a side effect of the medication. I stayed until 10 p.m. when my stepfather returned. Afterward, I left, went to the parking lot, and lit a cigarette. I couldn't stop coughing after taking a few puffs. Once I got in the car and drove home, the coughing continued. I felt like something was stuck in my throat, and eventually, I coughed up something and spat it into the foam cup in my car's cup holder. When I parked at home and checked, I saw a black and red sticky substance. I assumed it was blood mixed with mucus. Though my mother's infection had improved, her kidneys continued to deteriorate. She and my stepfather decided against dialysis, and she was sent home on hospice. During her last few days, many relatives gathered at the house. My mother frequently complained about seeing the little girl, describing her as Asian, wearing a black dress, and with dark circles around her eyes. My mother would point to where she saw the girl, but no one else could see her. This went on for a few days until my mother passed away. We held her funeral without any issues, and buried her at the city cemetery. Shortly after my mother's death, my wife became pregnant with our fourth child, a son. We hadn't planned the pregnancy, but we decided to keep the baby. We even picked out a name, Stephen. Later, however, tests revealed that Stephen had Down syndrome. My wife and I were shocked and saddened. While we didn't plan to terminate the pregnancy, I developed a persistent cough that eventually led me to the hospital, where I was diagnosed with early-stage lung cancer. I had been a long-term smoker, and while I had tried to quit many times, I felt like I deserved it. Fortunately, the cancer was caught early, but the tumor was in a difficult location for surgery. My only options were chemotherapy and radiation. I'd seen how sick chemotherapy could make people, which worried me. When I was discharged from the hospital, my wife and I had a difficult conversation. We both worked, and she would be left to care for a sick husband and a child with Down syndrome. We ultimately decided to abort the baby, but we hadn't yet scheduled an appointment. One day, I went for my cancer treatment. I was put on a table and given an injection, and though I felt numb and couldn't move, I was aware of everything. Suddenly, the doctor was cutting off my left leg and then my left arm. I was in immense pain but couldn't move or scream. My wife woke me up and told me I was shouting in my sleep. Thank God it was just a dream. We laughed about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I remember my first chemotherapy. I felt fine right after the treatment, but a few days later, I started feeling sick. I was on the couch watching TV and feeling very nauseous. I could hear my wife on the phone in the dining room, making an appointment to have our baby aborted. Our kids were already at school, and it was daytime. I noticed movement in the dark hallway. I turned my head and saw a figure of a little girl standing at the end of the hallway, staring at me. I sat up and took a second look, and she was still there, just looking at me. She had a tiny face with dark circles around her eyes and was wearing a black dress. I freaked out and started yelling at the figure. My wife had just finished her call, so she came over and asked what happened. I told her what I saw, and we both looked, but the little girl was gone. I was still in shock and disbelief, because I had seen the same girl my mother saw before she passed. You know what that means? It means I'm going to die too. I'm seeing the same spirit that my mother saw. That night, while I was sleeping, I felt someone touching my hair. I thought it was my wife, but the hand and fingers were too small. I was already awake and aware, but pretended to be asleep. I opened my eyes a little and saw my wife still sleeping beside me. Whatever was touching my hair was on the opposite side. I knew my kids were old enough, and they wouldn't do that. So I counted 1, 2, and 3 in my head. I quickly grabbed the hand and realized it was just a little arm with no body. I was holding a bloody little arm, so I screamed and threw it on the floor. My wife woke up and turned on the light on her nightstand. She asked what I was doing, and I said I had tossed a little arm on the floor and asked her to look at it. She looked around and told me to go back to sleep. There was nothing there. The next day, I called my doctor and asked if chemo could cause hallucinations. My doctor said that chemo could cause hallucinations, but it's very rare. Usually people taking chemo who experience hallucinations have brain tumors or cognitive impairments. In my case, the doctor didn't think the chemo was causing the hallucinations. Later that day, I went to my friend's house to hang out because staying home made me feel sicker. We hung out for a bit and then went out for some Chinese food. After we got back to my friend's house, I drove home. It was already dark when I arrived. I parked in the driveway and saw the little girl in the black dress standing by the door in the dark. Then she walked to the side of the house. I quickly got out and followed her, but no one was there. I knew I wasn't hallucinating. I was seeing the same thing my mother saw before she died. This was a bad sign, a sign that I was going to die too. I started reading about lung cancer, and it freaked me out even more. That night, I had a dream that I was walking into a clinic. When I got inside, I saw my mother and a doctor in a room. My mother was holding the girl in the black dress down on a table while the doctor was trying to cut her arms and legs off. The little girl was screaming and screaming. I opened the door and asked what they were doing. My mother and the doctor both looked at me. The little girl got up, ran over to me and hugged me. She appeared scared and said, "Big brother, please don't let them cut me. Please don't let our mother abort me." I woke up in a panic for some reason. My wife was still sleeping beside me. It was only 2 a.m. That day, we were supposed to go to the clinic to abort baby Stephen. I went back to sleep and had another strange dream. I dreamed that my wife and I were at the abortion clinic, and she was going through the procedure. There was a TV monitor in the room so I could watch how the procedure was done. When the doctor went inside the womb with forceps and touched Stephen's leg, he was kicking. Then the doctor cut his leg off, and the baby moved as if he was in pain. I woke up from that dream too, breathing heavily. I hadn't been able to get much sleep. That morning, after my wife took the kids to school, we drove to the abortion clinic. When we talked to the doctor, she told us that she would inject medication to stop the baby's heart before starting the procedure or the dismemberments. After hearing this, I told my wife that I needed more time to think. We went back home without going through with the abortion. When we got home, I called my stepfather because I wanted to see him. That day, I went over to his house. After some talk, I asked my stepfather if my mother ever had an abortion. He confirmed that she had one when they found out their child had Down syndrome, so they decided to abort. But that was a long time ago. My stepfather asked why I was asking such a strange question, and I told him about my encounter and the dream with the little girl in the black dress. He had a sad look on his face and repeated that they had gone through an abortion, but it was a long time ago. After that, I went home and told my wife everything. We decided not to go through with the abortion. Nowadays, Stephen is already 14 years old. He's healthy and normal. He didn't have Down syndrome. The screening we did must have been a false positive or something, but I'm grateful we never went through with the abortion. I've been cured of cancer for a long time now and quit smoking. I haven't seen the girl in black anymore. She might have been the child my mother and stepfather aborted all those years ago. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.